there was the pernicious notion of belief that something it could be a better or worse experience than the present experience. Because that experience of like a lucid dream where I don't have that belief, and I'll be looking at something, and it's just like amazing, breathtaking. But in sort of waking life, it tends to be an overlay of thinking things to be better or worse. I noticed we went to the Detroit Institute of Arts and over the weekend. It's a really nice museum, and it's full of wonderful stuff. And like whenever I was looking at something, I was kind of also thinking there might be something better to my left or right. And like today, I was walking around the ferry building where I work. It's beautiful. I noticed lots of times I have kind of a bitter attitude, actually believing that, well, this is great and beautiful, but it's going to go away. I was just noticing that. And, I'll carry that around. At a certain level.
Well, the main thing is it's just not true.
Yeah.
So you carry it around, but you don't actually, need to.
Yeah.
And it doesn't block reality. It doesn't change reality, but it affects how intimately you can be with it and how you can notice it. Let's say, and how much you can participate in appreciating it, I guess.
Yeah. I see consciously how it's unnecessary and untrue, and when I analyze, it's like all this. Like when I look at it, I see it's not true. But then there's the sort of pattern or position of hypnosis.
Yeah, the trick is not to approach it analytically, but approach it by bypassing it by going to the texture of experience. So when you're in any experience, your mind may be assessing it and qualifying it and whatever, but even as that is occurring, there'll be the actual experiential texture of the experience is astounding, and it's really explicitly astounding. And if you let your attention be directed to that rather than going to the abstraction of qualifying it, eventually that just the experience of that textual presence and its obvious uncapturable nature just renders the different ways of holding it as less and less relevant without needing to stop. It's not a matter of stop doing it or training yourself to not do it or something. So you emasculate it. It's like going to a rock show and have someone next to you making annoying, distracting sounds. Who cares? Because you're at a rock show. You can't hear them anyway. And likewise, these little mental qualifications of, this, gosh, it could be better, or this sucks, or whatever, is going on, but it's going on in the face of this astounding, multidimensional presence of inconceivability. It's just really explicit and obvious. So it's really a matter of sort of acclimatizing yourself more and more just to go to textural presence rather than snap, the knee jerk of going to a point of view, going to a reaction or a take on it, a mental abstraction of it.
Yeah. It's not even conscious, it's like a whole thing.
No, of course. It's like the horse going to the barn because that's where it's always gone. That's what you do, and so you just do it because that's what you do. So it's kind of a retraining thing.
Yeah. But even the feeling of being distracted or something better, that has its own textual quality.
Yeah, certainly.
Very directly.
Certainly.
It can all be tasted.
It depends on what phase you are at of sophistication and being able to be with texture. If you find yourself getting really caught in abstractions very heavy-handedly a lot of the time, then a more heavy remedial approach might be beneficial. And it's certainly true that, thought and that all these abstractions are themselves transcendental, but the problem with going right to that is it's like an alcoholic going into a bar to discover that, they don't need a drink. Yeah, you can discover you don't need a drink, but going into a bar might not be the best way to do it if you're just off the wagon. Once you have some build up some chops with other ways of living your life, then maybe you can go into bars. But it's, it's what I usually recommend is, in this yoga is first be with what's really neutral for you. Don't go to anything that has any kind of, has a minimal analytical component. Analytics is the wrong way to put it. A minimal frame of reference on it. Something that's just relatively meaningless to you, and be with that experience there, just as a training exercise, like training wheels, to familiarize yourself with what it means to be with just pure experiential presence. And then as you build up chops with that, as you build up, a skill or an effortlessness at being able to do that, then you can sort of broaden your horizon and let yourself be with aspects of your experience that you may have more tendency to qualify, so on and so forth. And ultimately, you can look at thought itself and mind itself and the addictive personality itself, and you see that that's the same thing too.
Well, it seems to me that a big part of this whole exploration is the quality of meaninglessness itself. So
Absolutely.
When you go at first, like you're suggesting, to something that feels meaningless, the blank wall, whatever.
Right.
But the fact that you experience it without any meaning, it seems to me what starts to be able to be danced with.
Exactly.
In terms of stuff that you think has meaning, well,
Right.
obviously,
Exactly. Yeah.
not about
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
It's a
Precisely.
little more subtle than that. You don't have no meaning. It's just the meaning doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. It gets.
The meaning is there.
The
somehow.
meaning is itself.
Meaning never meant anything.
The
But
meaning
you see
never
that
meant anything.
meaning never meant anything
And
because you
that's
see the
right.
context of meaning itself, which is absolutely transcendental.
But the meaning itself doesn't go away.
Right.
We have to, I think it gets into the question here, because I think meaning can mean two things. The meaning can mean something relative and interrelated to, like, it means something that you did something, so that means something about you or whatever. That's one kind of meaning. Another kind of meaning is just the fact of things, the sheer presence of whatever it is. It seems to me those are.
Well, that's real. That's the real meaning.
Yeah.
I call that meaningfulness.
Is that what you're talking about here? Okay. Well, I just wanted to make sure that we were talking
But that doesn't go away.
No.
Just
about. No,
it's meaningless.
It's the whole connection with something else. Like the meaning of water is itself. There it is. It doesn't have any. It doesn't.
Well, but you're saying there's no abstraction.
Yeah.
Because when there's abstraction, there's a phenomena, and then there's a mental picture of it, and then there's a relationship between the two. And relating to abstractions becomes deflated as being relevant. So abstractions as presence just become presence, and they're no longer abstractions, which are not about anything. And then everything is just itself.
Yeah.
Including mentality is just itself. And nothing relates to anything else. But when you don't see that, when you aren't aware of the absolute inclusiveness of presence, then there's phenomena, and then there is what the phenomena are, according to an internally held mental mapping or interpretive framework and so on and so forth, that is unconsciously held to be real, as opposed to purely imaginary. So again, as one familiarizes oneself with that, with the actual presence of experience and the nature of what that is, one discovers the way in which that is, which cannot be held, it cannot be imagined, cannot be conceived of, cannot be described, and yet is completely obvious. So it's you can train in it by directly being with it, so to speak, and then it shows you what it is, even though you can't say what it is and can't translate that into words, but nonetheless it's immediately evident, and as your familiarity with that, and so hence your accessibility to that mode of presence, let's call it, increases, then you can look around and notice that everything is the same way. But initially, when you're trying to discover that, you're liable to keep stumbling and tripping over the knee-jerk, going to abstraction as a way of relating to reality.
But even that, I suppose, I mean, God knows, should have done that.
Sure. Well, everyone's done it.
Yeah, and so in that, somehow there's a discovery.
Yeah.
At least a dead end. Dead endedness.
Yeah, maybe. But this is a matter of efficiency. I mean, one way to solve the problem of life is just to live. And that certainly does the trick. But this, what I'm proposing as what I'm calling a yoga is just, a proposed approach that is maximally efficient rather than letting luck take its course. Because ignorant, I mean, to qualify it in normal spiritual terms, an ignorant or a less mature approach to experience forgot what I was going to say. Okay. Oh yeah, an ignorant approach to life ignorance tends to be self-reinforcing, which is why it's challenging. When you're used to going to abstractions as a way to relate to experience, the tendency is to go back to the abstractions to find solutions. And from that perspective, the notion that if you go to the most meaningless, irrelevant portion of your experience, that is actually the point of maximal value to you, doesn't really compute from within that mindset. Because I'm going to go to what's interesting to me. I'm going to go to what's juicy. I'm going to go to what I get upset about. I'm going to go to what I get worked up about. I'm going to go to my problems and my goals rather than going to just, the corner of a cloud in the sky or a particular leaf fluttering outside the window. Who gives a shit about that? It's not interesting. And yet, so as a result, the normal approach to life or the unevolved approach to life tends to be self-perpetuating. I mean, it's not ultimately self-perpetuating, of course, but its mode is less efficient. Whereas, the mode of yoga is to play on what's available, play on the same system, but do it with maximal efficiency to the extent that's possible.
Well, it's funny because in a way, what happens is everything becomes self-liberated.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's almost like the same thing.
Exactly. And then the liberation becomes self-perpetuating. But it's because everything gets turned inside out, everything gets turned upside down.
It's almost like it's the same exact kind of motion.
It is the same motion. It's the basic motion of the life force, the basic motion of consciousness. But consciousness is always being with itself, but in ignorance, it does it in a very baroque and non-recognized way. Whereas in realization, it does it in a very direct and immediate and satisfying way. Consciousness wants to be with itself, and realization it gets to be with itself, and so it's a complete win-win. It's like it's Christmas every instant, right? Yeah, which is all consciousness ever wanted, and consciousness is trying to do exactly that, through the more ignorant modes, but it does it very inefficiently and essentially stupidly. And very with unnecessary complication and unnecessary sort of baroque, elaborate process, which is entirely unnecessary. But it doesn't know that because it's well-meaning but clumsy because it's not, doesn't know its own ropes. And so yoga is really a matter of showing consciousness its own ropes, and then once it sees that, its very impetus to be with itself, it recognizes, oh, this is what I've wanted all along, and then you're off and running. Yeah. And because it's exactly that consciousness does the same thing all the time. It chases fulfillment. But in an ignorant mode, it mistakes what that fulfillment consists of. It gets caught up in all sorts of elaborate and ultimately frustrating complexities. But when it discovers that fulfillment is simply itself and is completely not only available but completely being engaged with absolute intimacy, it's like, oh, cool, the finish line, thank God. The race is over. Yeah. Christmas every moment. Christmas and birthday and whatever else.
Funny, I think in some way our very frustration, like Jeremy has been pointing out, that feeling of frustration with the abstraction, that quality of something else is right inside of that is the knowing.
Sure, of course, because it is trying to find itself, and the frustration is its recognition of wait a minute, this what I'm doing is I'm banging my head against the wall and it hurts, I don't like it, but it doesn't know any better, but it knows it's not right somehow. Which ultimately leads to yoga, leads to the true discovery because of its the inherent life. If there was satisfaction, then who gives a shit about realization? If the unevolved approach of consciousness was truly satisfying, hey, dude, who cares? It's like hang out there. But it isn't. It's ultimately, even if you have magical karma and you're young and rich and healthy and handsome and intelligent and everybody loves you, or what, right? Whatever. Even if that happens, there's still going to be elements that are going to be frustrating or confusing or jarring elements, dissonant elements that are going to ultimately pose the question of, wait a minute, is this the best way? And in actuality, the answer to that question is a resounding and obvious yes. Whereas in these more immature approaches, the answer is always a question mark. Even if it's really good, potentially, it's never like, yeah, this is it. It's just like, well, okay, this is great. Yeah, this is really good. Is it? Isn't it?
Well, actually, that brings me back to the kind of question we've been dealing with a little earlier, which is the question of suffering itself and the sense of the sort of intensity and immediacy. Mm-hmm. In a sense, I think that's why we developed that, or why that form is. It's kind of like a sort of an unconscious opening to direct experience.
Absolutely.
In a kind of rough way.
Absolutely. It's you could say reality's goal is to know itself with ever increasing depth and richness forever. That's its goal. And every aspect of its process is in service of that goal. So even ignorant modes and immature modes of being with itself are in service of that goal. So they are enactments of that again. So again, it's just a matter of different degrees of efficiency. Running the race is getting to the finish line, but being at the finish line is getting to the finish line more efficiently than having to run the race to get to the finish line.
Well, you've often said that the baby is as mature as it is.
Absolutely.
And that everything is sort of in whatever mode it's in.
Oh, absolutely.
So, is the suffering artist who really intensely exploring that quality of direct experience? That's just a mode, right?
Sure. I mean,
I'm not sure what I mean to say that, but it's like it's somehow like all even somehow. There's some sort of equalization in the whole thing.
it's all the same. It's all exactly the same. But realizing it's all the same is what realization looks like.
There's a tricky way to solve this feeling like a carrot, which also like, hearing doesn't end with suffering or that. All stuff also ends up so I feel like, well, there's a way out. I just only get to taste it, or I can kind of see it. I can feel it there. But, and then there's a comparison of like, oh, like I seem to be suffering, so
Sure.
But
any information the mind seizes on and turns it into its gamesmanship of value judgment of this versus that, and winning versus losing, all that. But that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether or not the mind seizes on realization or yoga itself for its own purposes of gamesmanship, because nonetheless, yoga and realization exist outside that context. So it doesn't matter what the mind's doing. And in fact, yoga and realization render what the mind's doing irrelevant. So it's not like you need to snatch that away from the mind, and it's just not within the purview of the mind at all. Yoga and realization are not mental concepts, and they're not things that you can win or lose. They're just facts. They're actualities. They're actualities and facts, and these actualities and facts can be engaged with as they are, which is beyond the reach of conceptualization. Even if conceptualization is trying to, creating a version of them in its own little game structure, is irrelevant because the actuality of them exists outside that context. I mean, again, it's so logical and commonplace to assume that, I have to solve the conundrums of my mind and then I'll be able to engage. But it's not like that. You let your mind have all these conundrums and engage and be its neurotic self, and you just bypass it because that's not the only thing that's happening. And so where the real work happens, where the yoga happens, is not within the realm of the mind. So it doesn't matter what the mind's doing. You can just turn it loose, even if you're totally psychotic. It's just basically completely irrelevant. So the mind can be doing all these, gamesmanship around spirituality, and that doesn't in any way inhibit yoga, because yoga is not happening in the mind. It's happening. It's totally, It's almost like maybe that's kind of what Jesus meant when he said, "Don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing."
Did Jesus say that?
Yeah.
Supposedly. It's all telephone. Yeah, there were no notaries and digital recorders back in Jesus' day, so we don't really know.
Jesus Gonzalez.
Right, Jesus Gonzalez, just down the street. I heard him saying that when I was walking around.
Right. Hernandez Jimenez. That one.
Okay, been sort of having complaint for a while. Over the past couple of years, and even talks of so my relationship to my more conscious thought and beliefs has changed a lot, and I know I'm not so troubled by stuff anymore, but then there's this before the pattern, the subconscious stuff. It's like I don't dwell on stuff before. It's like I would call it debating anxiety, like subtle anxiety.
Sure.
And then I noticed in the retreat, I guess there's a format more the meditation is doing that to examine all that stuff more directly and get sort of underneath it and see even doing those holdings or whatever. I think I'm calling that like energy infusion.
Yeah.
So there's like touching that and that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, and that's always the yoga. The yoga consists of just touching the energy directly. And typically it's just little moments of that, and then but it's powerful and it's cumulative. And also, the progress in yoga is not necessarily obvious because it doesn't happen within the mind and it doesn't even address the mind. Like you say, you'll notice a slight shift in how you orient to things in a certain way, and it may not seem to be drastic or not, but it's a little bit of something. And that's a sign of progress in the yoga, even if the fundamental situation seems unchanged. But again, spirituality is notoriously difficult to assess in terms of your place in it or your progress, because as you make progress, if you make actual progress in integration, at the same time your sensitivity increases. So, you always kind of seem to be in the same place. You seem to have, God, I'm just as fucked up as I ever was. But maybe you're not nearly as fucked up, but you're 10 times more sensitive. So the lesser fucked up you have can seem to be bigger than it is.
Yeah.
But that's a very real phenomenon, and it's absolutely constant in spirituality. But in general, any sort of general shift of things lightening up or things this or things that is a sure and certain sign of progress in yoga. And even if it feels like, oh, but I'm still stuck, it's like, it's not like that. It's not like that. You don't gauge. That's the mind. The mind's trying to say, am I winning or losing? Am I getting it or not getting it? But that's not the point. The point is to be in the engagement, and the engagement is an eternal process. And even when you get it, you're still in the engagement. It's still an eternal process. It just, there's a certain sort of a critical mass is reached where the irrelevancy of what was seemed relevant in the past just no longer seems relevant. But still in all, it's not like things stop. It's not like, there's a cessation. On the contrary, the very nature of what is happening here continues to happen and will happen for all time, just like it always has happened for all time. But you just participate with it as it is and see it as it is. And you've always been participating with it as it is, and you always will be. But you may not have seen it as it is. But in realization, the only difference is to see it as it is. It's not a change of condition at all. So realization is not the gaining of anything or the loss of anything. It's just seeing nakedly what it has always been, which paradoxically is very freeing. But you aren't actually free of anything that you were ever not free of. You just see that you have always been free. Again, trying to put it and trying to describe it in words gets a little baroque.
I felt at the retreat there was around the past week, like I saw the shift, and it inspired me to go back and listen to the first stop song I ever went to this years ago. And that was a trip because, and that's where I could see the progress, because I remember I went there and I felt like I talked too much, and I felt all nervous when I left, and I'm never going to listen to that again, and all that kind of stuff, and like I hardly talked at all. It was fine, and like I was fine to listen to the recording, and like there was so much tension that I see was just not there anymore. Yeah. And it was also interesting because Mike was, to go back and listen to the talk, because I started to notice some new things in what you were saying, what was going on in the group, and I went back. So I think when I listened to that lecture in that talk, I realized that all that stuff is there too, and I was listening to it on a certain level, but then as I have sort of more subtle understanding of it, I see that is there.
Yeah.
Also, all along.
Yeah. I mean, it's the subtlety of this yoga, because so much of it happens irrationally, and so I mean, it looks like what we're doing is sitting around here and talking and exchanging some cool ideas and all that, which we are doing, but at the same time, parts parts of me are talking to parts of you that are not rational and not logical at all, and that's happening as well, and that's sort of encoded as fractal spin-offs of the words and so on and so forth. So it's all very, very multi-leveled phenomena, and the conscious mind may or may not have access to vast portions of it.
It seems to me that it gets actually more complex as you start to see more and more levels.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's true. Yeah. Well, you let go of needing to collapse it to some kind of sense or linearity, and then so you get more and more comfortable with the wow factor of just woo.
The complexity actually doesn't matter.
Yeah. And then you don't have to shield yourself from it by censoring it, by clamping down.
Which is what Jeremy was describing.
Yeah.
He had this experience, but now it's a much more subtle and refined experience of the same thing.
Yeah. Which will always be the case.
Always be the case.
There's nothing else to experience.
That's my point.
I was looking at this and that in terms of denial. And I was thinking, well, am I just denying things? I mean, it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
will this go by and
Yeah. No, that's a really good way to look at it. It's a very simple way to look at it because, realization is just you're stopping using denial as a mode. And modes that are less more primitive or less more spiritually immature modes are essentially held in place through denial. It's kind of a censorship because everything's always present, but most of it is not being. It's like a kind of a hypnosis where you don't acknowledge it. It's like if someone hypnotized you, just said, you're going to walk in this room and all you're going to see is the furniture and the people. And you come in the room and you hang out and you leave and someone asks what color are the walls and you go, I don't know, I didn't really notice. So it's a kind of a tunnel vision of selective noticing, selectively letting yourself see what's there. Whereas, of course, everything is actually here the way it is. And being with that as it is, in all of its whatever, is all that realization is. It's a lack of denial of things that don't. It's a maturity that doesn't insist on things making any sense. Because most of experience makes no sense at all. In fact, all of experience makes no sense at all. And even our efforts and our success at making it make sense makes no sense. So, David Byrne was right. And making sense always happens by denial. It's like you look at politicians. That my platform. This is our platform, and it makes sense. And that all of that stance is held together by a denial of any information to the contrary. Whereas a more open-minded approach is, well, this is one possible platform, and it makes sense because of this, but there's all this other contradictory information that we're not particularly emphasizing that may apply other approaches, each of which is also partial, and so on and so forth. Not yet, turn the days yet. We'll take a dessert break in a few minutes. Yeah, I mean, probably the weirdest thing to understand in this yoga is that everything that is experienced in the realized condition is already being experienced in the unrealized condition, but it's not being acknowledgedly experienced. It's not being. One doesn't let oneself know one's experiencing it because there's this amazing censorship that happens essentially psychologically or energetically.
Not being enjoyed.
It's not being enjoyed. Yeah.
Mhm.
But it's essentially being censored out of existence, even though it does exist. but it's sort of hypnotically being censored out of existence.
I don't enjoy that. It's not a resistance.
Well, whatever.
Well, here's a question. Well, but so the consciousness is doing that
Sure, of course.
ultimately.
Yeah, consciousness does everything.
So, I don't know. That seems to have some interesting implications about why. Well, I mean, why it doesn't do it sort of, or why for some people it does and for other people it does. I don't know. Like when I went to see this movie the other day, and I couldn't believe. I mean, these are really intelligent people, and they were in a wonderful place, Paris. But I mean, there was just no hint of any, awareness of consciousness. I mean, it was just all involved in the relationship and what's going on. And I don't know that, but getting back to my original question, I mean, it's sort of like it's a trickster or something. I mean,
Well, it is. Consciousness has enormous power over itself, which shows up in the phenomena of hypnosis and these kinds of things. And it shows up in the phenomena of selective attention and all sorts of things like that. Consciousness has enormous power over itself, and it exercises that power in what it thinks is its best interest. But if it's acting in a condition of relative ignorance, it may have good intentions and think it's acting for its own self-interest, but ultimately not really doing what's going to be maximally satisfying to its goals. And its only goal is to experience itself. Consciousness is a slut for experience. Consciousness loves experience. Consciousness is an experience junkie. Consciousness has an experience Jones that is just like gone.
Yeah.
And so in service of that, it goes after its experience, but it does it when it's in ignorant modes. It thinks it's serving a purpose by trying to make it make sense. And to make it make sense, it has to be very selective in experiencing only certain things that it has the power to correlate into some framework that seems to make sense to it. And when consciousness begins to mature, it begins to relax this urgency of needing to make sense. And in that sense, it can relax the censorship and let in a lot of random information that it can't possibly pull into any kind of coherence. And lo and behold, it discovers that it actually is getting closer to its goal of total immersion in intoxication of self-knowledge, which is all it ever wants.
Yeah.
So it discovers that the most efficient and fulfilling way of being with itself is total, no holds barred immersion without any constraint, as opposed to its immature mode, which is a supposition that constraints of coherence or constraints of logic are somehow going to ring its bell, going to be fulfilling for it.
So, in talking about consciousness, I mean, to the extent that I can, I can only be talking about my consciousness. I mean, consciousness is not particularly universal.
Your consciousness is the universal consciousness. Right. There's no other consciousness. You are the universe. We are the world. Everybody.
We are the world.
You are the world.
I am the world. Yeah, that's pretty weird. I mean, when I was thinking about, everybody has consciousness. Well, if it was universal, it can just be simultaneously, playing around with all kinds of different people's neurons or whatever it's playing with.
Well, it is, except there's no people. It's just consciousness is simultaneously playing with all energies of its being.
Right.
Which happens to, for you, consist of every energy that shows up within the infinite field of your experience.
It really is impossible to think about consciousness as being universal.
No. It may or may not be, but that's irrelevant because I mean it's like worrying about whether the refrigerator light goes off when the door's closed.
Yeah.
I mean, before the expansion of the VCR. Finally, we have the technology to answer the great age-old riddle.
Right. How they bleed it?
You turn on the VCR, put it in your refrigerator, and close the door, so the light goes up.
Video. No, it's right on video. Actually, I put my laptop in there and then watch it on video.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You can watch it in real time. You can put it on Justin TV. Okay, folks. Here's the answer to the age-old question. Stay tuned. Tomorrow night at 9 p.m. show.
It stays on. It doesn't go through like the wave pattern.
Schrodinger's light.
But anyway, it seems to me that consciousness itself, at least what we're referring to there, I think that consciousness itself is just another constraint.
Of course.
I mean, but unconsciousness.
Well, consciousness in this context is just a euphemism for this, for the actuality.
Yeah, which includes a whole lot that I have no consciousness of.
Well, you say that.
Well, it's like dark energy. I don't know what it is. I don't know what consciousness is or unconsciousness. All I know is that there's stuff. Well, I don't even know that. I don't know.
This is as it is.
Yeah. So, the idea that it seems to me that the sense of consciousness doesn't have to be, it's not self-known. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter at all. No idea matters. All ideas are irrelevant. Only actuality matters.
We probably say direct experience. What is that?
Yes, that's what this is. This isn't direct experience, but direct experience is this. Direct experience is a sign, is a hand pointing at the moon of this. Just like consciousness is a hand pointing at the moon of this. But it's about the moon, it ain't about the hand.
So just a recap. What do you say?
A brief recap.
Yeah, we'll do that. A brief recap.
Porter, please read back the last 40 minutes.
Everything is radiation. When consciousness wants to make sense of it, there's going to be a lot of censorship and
Right.
just a few bands will come in.
Yeah.
And that everything else is still there, but
It's not being
the
acknowledged.
mechanism that's allowing it not to be seen.
Yes. Or not to be recognized or not to be noticed. It is present, but it's not, it's just not noticed. Exactly.
It
And
seems to me that that's exactly what is noticed is that, like in discriminating consciousness, if you can not notice it, right, or there is a noticing, and it's still discriminating consciousness. It's not particular.
of course, it's always the same
But the
thing.
difference is that you already know something that it's thinking.
Sure.
So
Sure. Realization consists of discovering what you've always known.
it's no different.
It's not different.
So that's why it doesn't matter if you're aware of it or not.
It doesn't matter in the least whether you're aware of it or not.
The only thing that matters to is the voice inside you says, "Oh, I'm suffering this or something." That's not the
That's all irrelevant because it's all still consciousness addicted to experience, and it doesn't really matter whether the experience is one of recognition, or the experience is one of suffering, or the experience is one of
Right. It doesn't really matter.
It's
But
absolutely
but
irrelevant.
the loaded word there is really.
because it's all really experiencing.
Right. It doesn't really matter. But if you think it matters, you're in delusion. And the remedy to being in delusion is yoga, in which case you discover it doesn't really matter, and you discover it never really mattered, and you discover you didn't need to do the yoga.
Saying that even that,
But you don't know that when it seems to matter.
No, but I'm saying that that's not even true because thinking that it matters is also just experiencing.
Of course
So
it is.
what?
Of course it is.
So exactly. So there's no difference.
Absolutely no difference.
Absolutely no difference.
Absolutely
But
no difference.
in the most absolute senses, which one can understand. In other words, go ahead and think you don't know. Go ahead and
Absolutely.
think you don't
Absolutely.
recognize.
Delusion is realization.
Because
I like
it
it.
doesn't matter.
I like it. That's great.
Well, am I right or am I right?
Yeah, but unless it does. No, and even when it does seem to matter to
Yes,
you,
it's true. It's totally.
it's still just experiencing.
Yeah, that's right. But if it's a problem for you, you might want to look at it.
It's not a problem. All
You're
it's
the Nazi.
no, no,
It's not a problem. You're not suffering,
No,
fat bitch.
no, it's just
Get out of here.
It's still just
You're like, go away.
No,
Quit bothering
wait a
me.
minute. No, but still, it's just experiencing.
Yeah.
So if you can settle into that suffering of thinking you don't get it and all this stuff, just let it be in it, awash in it, in that experiencing.
That's the yoga, the being awash part.
I love getting
Exactly. See, who doesn't?
I was saying,
love soaking in your tub. Love experiencing. You know, it's like a soap opera. Oh, it's just so wonderful. Larry's movies that I got with the morning says,
The refrigerator one is interesting to me because we assume, and I don't have a VCR here,
See?
but because of that, we're just assuming that there's all this unconscious and other people seeing things.
Of course. Exactly so.
And how in the world can I verify that? How justified am I even assuming that?
right.
Except insofar as I may posit that, and which my positiveness of it is the only thing I don't know.
Exactly so.
So all we got is here and now.
Exactly so. Precisely.
Yeah.
Inclusively. Here and now, just as it happens to be.
And that's all of it.
All of it.
All she wrote.
All she wrote. Underlined in caps with an exclamation point.
And there is no differentiation between here and
Right.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, here and now are synonyms.
Yeah, I have a lot of trouble with that one too. Just that, you know, so often the analogies are just legion about the mirror and what's in the mirror and the water and the reflections in the water. And there can't be any difference between the two, but I sure feel the difference between consciousness and that which that which is arising and that which is arising within.
But you can't ever have the one without the other. So in what sense is there a one and another? Why not the one and the other are both this? Because you never get the one without the other.
I seem to get one without the other.
You do, eh?
Yeah, I know.
Look closely.
I don't understand that.
What, give me an instance of where you get a one without another.
Well, I can feel the difference between them.
Right.
They're both together.
Okay.
That is to say, this is arising, and at
Right.
the same time, I feel a presence, which is not quite the simple, the forms that you mentioned. I seem to feel.
Right. Well, it may not be limited to the forms per se, but the forms completely embody and consist of the same presence.
Yeah.
And you can't find that presence apart from forms because there's always form, even if it's exceedingly subtle. There's no such thing as a formless realm or formless experience. And there can be pseudo-formless experiences, but that's just exceeding a certain threshold of subtlety where it seems to be nothing happening. But even nothing itself is a form.
I haven't fully explored that.
There's always content, and the content is always perceived content. So there's always content and there's always perceiving. It's impossible to find a mechanism or entity of the perception that is doing the perceiving. All you can say is there is perceiving,
Mm-hmm.
and the perceiving, and there is content that is perceived. And so verbally and logically we have a perceived and a perceiving. But if you go looking at reality, you never find a perceiving without a perceived, and you never find a perceived without a perceiving. So it may just be that there are logical duality and verbal duality that's not an actual duality. In other words, there may be one phenomena that the mind and structure of language insists on putting in terms of a subject and an object, or a subject and a verb, or a verb and an object, or what have you.
If you found a perceiver, that would be perceived.
Yeah.
Going through the time.
That I'm sure of. I have never found to perceive it.
But like for an example, a good example of that is the statement "I am." So "I am" is a verbal statement, but you can't find an "I" apart from being, and you can't find a being apart from "I." So again, "I am" is a purely verbal and semantic construction, and the seeming duality of it is just an artifact of grammar. It's an artifact of the inaccuracy of the structure of language. The phenomena itself is a whole. It's just a simple fact that I am is just this given that is, and and language insists, there's being. Okay, what is? Well, I am. There's an I. Well, I am. So, but you see what I mean? It's a logical. It's implied by the structure of logic and the structure of language, which is its own game system with its own rules, not by the inherent, let's call it, structure of the phenomena itself, of being itself, or of selfness itself.
Was it possible to sort of focus on the beingness and then to focus on the appearance?
Well, you can pretend to, but
Not
you can't.
that they're different, but you can emphasize one or the other. Is that a workable experiential thing?
If you emphasize one or the other, you can never actually isolate one or the other. So even if you can find some condition which seems to be emphasizing beingness, it is still in some context of maybe more subtle appearing.
Yeah.
And likewise, if you find a context which emphasizes the appearances, there's going to be still some subtle degree of the perceiving there, or there would be no appearances.
Yeah.
I mean, the very nature of appearance is to perceiving.
Appearance is a perceiving.
Yeah. I mean, the reality turns out to be that it's one thing. And we're used to thinking it, we're used to polarizing it and dualizing it the way we think of it, and our language does that, and so on and so forth. But the actual phenomena, experientially, if one looks very closely, one just can ultimately discover that it's one thing.
So I see that, and I still see what I'm pointing to.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those are still floating there. It's all settling down.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, this is subtle because it's one thing, but it's not. But it's infinitely dimensional and infinitely differentiated within itself, without departing from itself. So it's one thing. It's one holistic. Call it an integration, or perhaps an unintegration would be a better term. But it presents as infinite dimensionality and infinite differentiation. So it's not a simple, stupid one of limitation. It's a unity of infinite inclusiveness, which is, it's an infinite unity. So that makes it a funny kind of bird. Because it has all of these astounding qualities and aspects and paradoxical seeming modes, all of which are it, none of which are actually this, that, and this, even though they're approachable in those terms, and of course we're all very familiar with doing that linguistically and philosophically. But it turns out that all of that creates confusion where it's not necessary, because it's one thing whose nature is infinitely differentiated, without any actual differencing, any actual difference, any actual this or that. And again, a very simple and clear example of this is a dream. A dream can seem to have all different sorts of things and actions and spaces and events and times and all this going on, and yet you wake up, there was only one thing there. The only thing there was dreaming. There was actually no things there, and there's a dreaming, which is one thing, can present itself as infinitely differentiated.
And how does the dreaming appear?
Exactly. How does it appear? It's its nature to appear.
It appears as anything.
It appears as anything, but it is always just itself, and it can appear as anything which is infinitely different from itself, without there being any actual difference present, because there's actually nothing there whatsoever than dreaming.
Can the itselfness be an experience? I'm asking, can it be apart from the dream? But
right.
Of course, they go together.
Yeah, the itselfness is an experience, but it's experienced as the dream, or as deep sleep, or as, this conversation, or what have you.
I'm going to be CR.
Get a VCR, put it in. I'll put it in the phenomena and take my experiencing away and see if there's any phenomena. Unfortunately, you won't be able to tell if there's anything on the tape unless you look at it, and all of a sudden the experiencer's back. And I know.
That's right.
Let's take. Why don't we have a 10-minute dessert break? All right, we're officially back.
So I was thinking, I was wondering about noticing the seeming.
Yeah.
And I was sort of doubting myself. I was thinking, when I look at phenomena, I just say, oh, it's just seeming, that's just seeming. But that's kind of mental. It's a little bit mental. Yeah.
But all mental is seeming too. It seems to be mental.
Right, yeah.
So when it seems to be mental, that is a seeming.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing about seeming, anything that is a certain way, all you can really say about it is it seems to be. Like, for example, you can say, existence is. You can't even say that. All you can really say is existence. It seems to be that existence is.
Right.
It seems to be that consciousness is experiencing phenomena. It seems to be that phenomena are present in all these forms. It seems to be that color is present. It seems to be.
Yeah.
Because the only thing you can know is that it seems to be that way. You can't know what it actually is.
Yeah, the seeming's a concept.
And even that is even if it actually is just a seeming too.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's funny. Sometimes if I look at something and to see this, let's say, seemingness of things, sometimes I can look at them on a macro level and go, oh, what I'm seeing is always changing all the time and never.
It seems to be, yeah.
Yeah, it seems, yeah. That goes with everything I say. Mm-hmm. On a macro level, And then sometimes I go in on a micro level and I go, look at that rug. Oh, it looks like it's kind of working around and sure. Moving around. But it's sort of like, how do you, I want to see that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want my mind to keep saying, well, this is just seeming. Seemings. I'd like to see that they're seeming, so to speak.
Well, they are, and that's perfectly seeable. In fact, you never see anything but that. It's a question of noticing that there's so many different frequencies.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's the sort of gross level of frequencies, you get this sort of overt gross wiggling.
Yeah.
At a fine level of frequency, it's just sort of a little like a buzzing.
Oh, yeah, right.
Like, like a dentist drill or something, or, some supersonic frequency,
Right, yeah.
It's so fine, it almost looks like nothing's happening because the wiggling isn't really, it's just like.
Exactly, right.
As opposed to sort of like this.
Yeah. Right. And then there's just the macro kind of look at it, that everything's always changing all the time.
Yeah.
Everything's morphing on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Instantaneously, yeah. I mean, the fundamental fact is, if you look at experience, you cannot find any constancy whatsoever.
Right.
You can't find anything that stays the same for any duration. Everything has zero duration of constancy. And that being the case, in the instant, whatever it is changing to the next explicitly.
Right.
So if you look at any phenomenon on any scale, like you look micro or look macro or look anywhere, the way that it senses as changing is because you're experiencing it as changing, and that experiencing it as changing is it morphing.
Right.
And that change can seem to present as with inconceivable subtlety and all that, but nonetheless it's really obvious.
Right, yeah. Right. So that's the
you never find yourself thinking, gosh, is time really passing right now? And that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen, and the reason it doesn't happen is because even if it's sort of extremely high frequency and extremely sort of subtle, it still is absolutely morphing every instant.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And remember, participating in an apparitional framework is that the perceiving of it is shifting too. So it's not just looking for shifting on an objective level, so-called. I mean, we're getting back to what Dean was talking about. It's easy to think, oh, there's an objective level and there's a subjective level, but every aspect of the entire system is completely changing every instant.
Right. Oh, yeah. Right.
So
yeah.
what's being perceived is changing. What's perceiving is changing.
Right. It's changing point of view.
Point of view is changing. I mean, exactly. And what's being noticed is changing, and the mood within which it's being perceived. I mean, everything is just continually. There's absolutely nothing that stays stable.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's how you get to clearly see that everything is a seeming, because everything is so much in morphing and motion and jumping around. Basically.
Yeah, and even what it is in any instant is not coherent.
Right.
It's not like it's conditions of coherence that are continually morphing into new conditions of coherence.
Right.
It's a continual morphing of incoherence into new incoherence.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah, that's even a
and
better point.
And yet it can seem to be coherent, which of course is another seeming.
Right. Right. So I don't have to. I mean, it's better, like you said the other day when we were talking at the Open Secret. It's better to really see the seeming directly, see the changing directly, feel the changing directly, rather than just say, "Oh, this stuff is just seeming."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, seeming is not an abstraction. It's the only reality.
Right. Yeah.
And again, you can look at a dream. You know, a dream is never actually even present. All you can say is it seems to be present.
Right.
A dream seems to be present. There seems to be an environment. There seem to be events there. There seem to be objects there. There seems to be time passing and interaction.
All right. Yeah.
And you wake up and you go that it was. There's absolutely nothing, no residue whatsoever, other than all this seeming.
Right. Yeah.
And likewise now, 5 minutes ago, what was the case 5 minutes ago? Where is it now?
Right. Yeah.
Well, it seemed to be there. It seemed to be here 5 minutes ago.
Right. Yeah.
And it has absolutely zero residue, other than the notion that this is the residue of that. But that's just an interpretation. Who knows?
Yeah. Like experience equals seeming.
Yeah. Because it seems to be experience.
Yeah, because it always
seems to be
experience.
And even the experience seems to be happening, or it seems to be experience is a seeming. Can't say what experience really is.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing is just question marks all the way down.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
But this question marks all the way down has infinite modes that it can seem to be. It's so easy for it to take itself in all of these potential, what I used to call resonant modes, all these different potential points of view that seemingly generate a pseudo-coherent, interpretation of what's going on.
Right, yeah.
But they're all just seemings because,
Yeah, because they are.
Yeah, because all you can say is, well, it seems to be kind of like that.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I was getting a little bit disturbed that I didn't see enough wiggling.
Yeah, right.
I didn't see enough, like, micro seeming.
You're not putting enough acid in your morning coffee.
Yeah, I think that's it.
But again, if you look closely at any experience, you find the wiggling.
Yeah.
But again, it can be very high frequency. It can be just kind of a little buzzing in place,
Yeah.
as opposed to a kind of
Absolutely, yeah.
as opposed to a line dance or something.
So that buzz doesn't come from what you see. That buzz is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's just is.
Yeah, it's the radiance buzzes. The radiance is a buzz.
So it seems.
Seemingly.
Well, it's kind of like the buzz is kind of like the frequency of back and forth, right? Or something.
Sure, whatever, yeah, who knows?
Something like that. And so like is like it's not.
It's true. Absolutely. Sure. Exactly. It's like a movie. But the frames are just flashing, but it just gets turned into a continual present.
But what's interesting is that when that's happened, it's like stuff is something. Everything's sort of suspended.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when what's suspended in a way to me is, or just a belief, or judging, or I'm describing everything in absence of stuff.
Sure.
But that's the only way I can do it, because I can't describe what it
Yeah.
is. But
Yeah, it feels like an openness, or
Yeah.
And the thing that always comes to me is that genius scene that Stanley Kubrick captured in the end of 2001, when the guy's gone beyond the speed of light or into hyperspace or God knows what, right? And what does hyperspace look like? It looks like an old man eating breakfast in a room with the floor glowing white. Like, why not?
right.
Who says what hyperspace? And it also looks like all these lights going. It looks like whatever, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like that, What does infinity look like? Well, it looks like us sitting here having this conversation. It's exactly like, a moment ago you were an astronaut flying past into hyperspace, and all of a sudden this is what it looks like. Whatever, right?
There was a lot of stuff in that TV series of Prisoner like that.
Yeah. Yeah, the feeling tone of being outside of, or relatively outside of frame of reference or frame of interpretation is this delightful, open. Austin Spare called it in-betweenness.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a delightful kind of a feeling of sort of openness or floatingness or whatever.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was trying to say. Outside of the.
Yeah.
Betweenness is nicer than the idea of off and on.
Yeah.
Because there is no off and on.
Yeah.
It just is.
Yeah.
And that's in between.
Yeah. Yeah, I love Austin Spare. Man was a genius.
So understated too.
Typical language. Huh? No, he died in the early 50s.
Oh, awesome. Oh, that's right.
He lived in the early part of the 1900s.
Not quite the same.
Bill Clinton. He didn't inhale. Mechanism has. Is he still alive? Is he ever alive? This goes out to you, Jed. This tries for you.
Yeah, that's I can say that in between.
Very evocative, isn't it?
Well, it's sort of in between this, but it's not in between anything.
Yeah.
No.
It's a
Well, that's why he didn't call it in between. He called it in betweenness. In between it. But he was a sorcerer, which means he was a genius and an artist, and so he was a genius at evoking these kinds of transcendentalities and manifesting them. Through his misuse of language and his misuse of imagery and his art and so on and so forth. S-P-A-R-E, Austin Spare. Austin Osmond Spare. That's his name. There's I think he wrote a handful of books, not much, and it's all available online. They're all very brief and cryptic.
Spent most of his life in the pub.
Yeah, wisely. My kind of guy.
I was having the experience yesterday, Peter, that everything is like a shadow, that just the sense that there isn't really anything at all, that it's just a shadow of something.
Yeah.
And that, that even myself, that I was just like a shadow of something.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
the sort of, this sort of, multi-layered thing.
Well, that's kind of what I call it. It's an intuition of what I call the transcendence. It's like everything is more than itself.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is itself, but there's more. Right. In it being it's more. It's like a shadow of or an inclusion of something more. You can't ever actually find that something.
Right. Because you're just actually saying some sort of reflection or some.
Yeah. You can't parse it.
Sort of
Yeah.
image.
Yeah.
More than what though? Is it more than what is being noticed? More than.
We can't get that specific with it. It's not like that.
So I don't think the word more.
Not important. Just a word.
I was talking to this man in Point Richmond who's building the telescope that's finding the waves, that are from the beginning of time.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, you probably enjoy meeting him.
Yeah.
And so he was very interested to know that I'd been on a retreat where we're looking at the nature of reality. He says that's what he does all the time.
Of course.
And so he's got this very,
We look at the same waves, only we look at them.
Yeah, this incredible universal sort of experience of reality from an actual, experiential point of view.
Yeah.
And, he's sort of saying globally that, reality is building a brain for itself through mediums of technology in order to try and see itself in actuality, not that it necessarily ever will, but, it's interesting that the fineness that he was saying, that he sees how everything diverges, the more you go in, the more diverse everything becomes.
Yeah.
I've been playing with the idea, but it's not even the idea, but there's this concept of everything is true. And that's a mind blower, on a conscious level, that statement is true, and everything is true. You can also say everything is false, but in fact, was seemed to be a way to access this.
It completely takes off the bracket. Anything to compare it to. You can't say it's not like everything is true and nothing is false. Everything is true. So there's no.
The way I would put it, or in yogic terms, is that any point of presence is a point of contact with actuality. And so everything, for anything to be a part of everything, it has to be a something, and anything that is a something in any sense whatsoever is a contact point with reality, and hence a point of revelation of actuality, i.e. truth. I don't know if that's
That's exactly it. But that breaks it down to something beyond the magical. Just the fact.
I think it's the very essence of the magical.
Well,
yeah.
It explains the magical.
Yeah.
The
without doing much explaining.
but it does explain that. I mean, it explains the way that it works. But just the statement, everything is true, for me is more magical. I don't know.
What's the koan?
It's true.
It is true, exactly.
Yeah, you get anything out of even the specifics though, because every specific is itself a koan, because it's a point of contact of absolute transcendentality. Anything whatsoever, no matter how actual and specific, if you're with what's actually there, it's an absolute koan. It's an absolute unsoluble riddle, a paradox and transcendence. Koan is what we got, and seeing that is, that's the very nature. Reality is the koan. The old in betweenness, or on here or not here, or here and not here, or whatever, all that stuff. Any whatsoever, any. That's the whole. That's why this yoga works, because any actuality whatsoever directly and obviously reveals the transcendent, and the transcendent means what? What happened? Where'd I go? Where did it go? What? And yet it's actual. It's not just a transcendence of negation. On the contrary, it's a revelation of just inconceivability.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah, it's totally awesome. It's so cool that this happens to be the way it is. What are the chances? What are the odds? Ultimately, sure. But when I was a kid, I had all the, my dreaded fears of what reality was, and then my delightful fantasies of what maybe it could be. And what it is, it far outstrips my wildest fantasy, my wildest delightful fantasies of what it could be. How fortunate is that?
Well, there's a certain degree of enjoyment too in expanding into that.
Oh, absolutely. It's pure bliss.
Well, just in terms of, the reality sort of builds awareness so much that there isn't room for the sense of anxiety or fear because it isn't real.
Yeah. And after a while, anxiety and fear and all these other things reveal themselves as transcendental revelations themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think that's sort of what's going on. Isn't that they're not there? They're just showing themselves as not those, held away things that have sort of been part of that childhood.
Yeah.
Everything is nameless.
Yeah. Beyond the beyond. Gone beyond, beyond.
Trying to sleep at night is really a big trip.
Oh,
Yeah, so obvious.
It's like, apparently waking up.
Yeah. No, it's mind-boggling.
There's all that betweenness there.
Yeah.
Had a great experience the other morning, maybe 2 mornings ago. I woke up and obviously the dream superimposed itself. I got up, I was sitting up in bed, I was seeing the room and I was seeing the dream.
all at the same time. It was so fabulously freaky. Because the things that were in the dream that came into the room weren't in the room, and so to speak. So it was like, oh shit, this room isn't here either. Which is which? You know? Yeah. It was a little discombobulating, but very exciting. Oh shit.
And you can, if you like that, you can increase the dose of LSD in your sleeping potion a little bit, and you'll get even more.
No, it's really freaky. It was so freaky. Oh shit. And it wouldn't dissolve itself either. It was like, okay.
Well, it's sweet where this is going, you know, I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
How we're just playing with it.
Sure.
It's not a matter of the baby. No,
Dancing the dance.
And this dream dissolves itself all the time. We just don't call it that. Bizarre, freaky. More of that.
I figured out that the light doesn't go out.
Without a VCR, eh?
Let me rephrase what I was saying. I think what I'm really trying to say is that there is something that doesn't change as in a kind of relationship, as it were, with everything which does change. Everything changes. There's nothing that's static for a split second.
Right.
But there is also a perception that there is something that doesn't change.
Right.
And I think I can bring it into the context of the yoga by saying the thing that doesn't change is presence.
Right.
Whereas everything that changes is everything else. It's the
radiance. Yeah.
It's the radiance.
Yeah. And it's meaningful to polarize those two in the two words radiant presence and so on, as I've done. But again, it's important to understand it's one thing, because the radiance is the presence and the presence is the radiance. And because, you know, what doesn't change is this doesn't depart from itself. I mean, I say that you've heard me say that, and what that refers to is this is constantly and eternally what it is, and it never becomes not that. It's never the case. It's never not that. It's never the case that that is not the case. And so that doesn't change, and yet it itself is intrinsically and infinitely differentiated, constantly changing, absolutely, you know, incoherent, or let's say multidimensionally coherent readout of continual change and all that. And yet all of that is this that is always, that never departs from itself. It's just, it is constantly exactly what it is. You know, as a unity. And even though that sounds like a paradox, these two conditions are so drastically different, they must be different things. And of course it seems that way, and we typically draw that inference of self and other and, you know, so on and so forth. But those kind of inferences are unnecessary, because, you know, when you get that, oh, this is just this, and this nature is to appear as all this, without ever not being just this.
Battery that breaches the battle when the lamps
Yeah, radiant presence is very strange, because the radiance and the presence seem so opposite in their nature. Presence is absolutely constant, absolutely undeniable, absolutely ubiquitous. There's nothing but, clearly. And yet there's all of this incredible information, which is, of course, present, i.e. is presence. And they seem to be so drastically and you know, oppositely different in their natures, and yet it's it's just the way this is. So, but it's irrational. So the fact that it doesn't make sense, of course, is no problem because it doesn't need to.
It tunes in a little bit with what John said about truth.
Right.
I was relating to that. Because truth is like presence. Sanskrit comes to our rescue here because the word sat means truth,
Right.
and it also means existence.
Right.
And so it means radiant presence, essentially. The truth is the presence, and the sat is the yes.
Sure. Yeah.
And they're one.
Yeah.
And they're both good. That makes me happy. I feel comfortable.
No, sure.
My comfort zone is important to me.
No, hey, why not?
We used to say 100 times a month.
I'm still saying. I try to find myself making sense of this. Like just right here now, I don't find that operating, but I know like everyday stuff going on, then it's happening all the time. Maybe the key is to just start looking for that through the day. What am I trying to? Maybe it's the same as figuring things out.
This is one and the same. It's trying to find a viable frame of reference, workable frame of reference, and which of course isn't a problem in itself. In terms of being with that, one easy thing to notice is even when you're making sense of things or finding a frame of reference or what have you, that's happening in a context which is bigger than that. In other words, the direct experience, there's always, just an arbitrarily huge amount of data present which doesn't fit into any current version of making sense of things.
Well, one really blatant example is just listen to the news, and then your liberal, bias comes up and yeah, but that's not good. It's easy to see through that. So I think there's a lot more stuff than that.
Yeah, but it's basically the same phenomenon. That's exactly the same. Just it can happen infinite.
More and more fine with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what's curious to me is that it is the same phenomenon shows up in so many all these different ways. Yeah, it's just like cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, intelligence has this astounding power to approach itself within various frameworks, to spit out these frameworks, to spit out hypotheses, and it does so unceasingly and multidimensionally. So it's simultaneously spitting out 1,000 or 1,000,000 or whatever, hypotheses of, it just sees something and it instantly generates, bang, 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 1,000,000 frameworks about what it might be and what might be going on, but aren't particularly coherent with each other or even with themselves. But it just effortlessly spits them out because it's just nature to do so.
But and right inside of all of that incoherence,
right,
the natural incoherence is that once that's felt in some way, becomes like the perfect undoing of everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it renders it irrelevant without causing the process to cease.
But there's a quality of that quality of language. It comes from that. It's like you could say it's not real, but it's not the tension between these two polarities, but it's not. It's by itself.
Yeah, sure.
It's like, but just that this this curling or unfurling, in a sense, comes up in so many different ways that I don't expect.
Mhm.
I mean, a step can be that.
Sure.
On foot.
Mhm.
Somebody shouting. That's a feeling I have. Or just anything.
Mhm.
On that quality.
Sure.
And the quality is of something unhappening or undoing at the same time as it's occurring, so that it's like that. And then there's just like releasing the cycle.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. Mhm.
Always.
Mhm. The Dzogchen makes a big deal about that releasing. You know, they call it the self-liberation. All dharmas self-liberate by their very nature. Yeah. Dharmas, which basically means any energy condition whatsoever, any actuality. And the path of Dzogchen is simply noticing that, being with that, and then there's nothing to do. You don't need to liberate anything because by the very nature of everything, it does it. It is that. It reveals that. Dzogchen doesn't worry about dukkha because it self-liberates. Yeah.
Well,
They got an answer for everything. Those Dzogchen lawyers are slick.
it's the stuff. It's the very same stuff. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the glue that gets self-liberated.
Yeah.
It is self it's liberating.
True.
It's liberating.
Suffering is the substance of suffering. Suffering is made of, is built of absolutely transcendental, liberated Dharmakaya. So, therefore, it's not that much of a problem.
It's not going to die. Yeah.
I was reading some of the long term love John.
Yeah.
It's the retreat and afterwards, and I have a hard time differentiating any extent from the other one because it seems like they're all it's kind of like, I guess, science on it. It seems to keep hitting on the same point, like all done with this kind of
Yeah.
over and over again.
Well, you know his writings, especially those writings, are are sort of high level Dzogchen, where you're just sort of looking down at it from above, so to speak, at this point of view and that point of view and that point of view and that point of view. You know, the sort of more remedial Dzogchen or structural Dzogchen, which says how and whatever, you know, what the three kayas are, how they work, what the Dharmakaya is, the nature of the Dharmakaya as intrinsic transcendental radiance, which shows up as a Sambhogakaya and so on and so forth. Basically, radiant presence shows how all, you know, basically what we talk about, how all experiential phenomena themselves are actually the presence of the transcendental radiant creative nature of absolute transcendence, i.e. the Dharmakaya. So, you know, it basically walks you through how phenomena are built of transcendental energy, of transcendence, and how you can see that, you know, moment to moment in real time in your experience and in any phenomena. If you look at, you know, what's present and what is made of and how it's present, you discover, wow. And so that's sort of the explanation of Dzogchen, but the books you're talking about are not on an explanatory level. they're more on a celebratory level. If for people who have had the explanations, who are sitting back and sipping their wine, it's Miller time, and they're like, yeah, this is cool, isn't it? And Lajama says, yeah, hey, look, consider this. Just like us tonight, yeah. We're all resting on our laurels, sitting back to that. Get a bunch of old yogis together. What do? Bullshit each other, of course. What else? So, different presentations of Dzogchen, in terms of Dzogchen per se, different presentations of Dzogchen are more appropriate for, depending on where your level of yoga is in terms of where you're at with it. And so those ones are more sort of a text for contemplation after you're really sort of entrenched in it very deeply. But there's other ones that are more sort of for ratcheting, for gearing up into it. They're a little more sort of like field manuals or cheerleading. Go team. Let's go out there and really kick some ass tonight, boys.
I like it. I like it.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Well, I was just whizzed through that hospital.
Yeah. Well, that's more.
Nice little,
that's more of an explanatory one. Yeah.
What's interesting to read those because things make much more sense now than they did.
Yeah.
It's good to see that.
Well, that's a really good barometer of your yoga practice, is how much these books make sense. Because I remember when you're a newbie, you read these books and you go like, God, there's something here, but I'll be damned if I can tell what they're saying.
Well, there seems to be no point. I mean, now there's no point. I'm like, there's absolutely no point.
There's a different kind of no point.
Yeah, right.
It's a no point while knowing what the point is, as opposed to the no point of like, what the fuck?
Well, but even reading a book that's sorry, even before you totally understand it stays with you.
Oh, sure, it's evocative.
In your unconscious states of sleep or deep sleep, something washes it all together. And puts it.
Absolutely, and that's the value of these really high level spiritual teachings, is they connect even if you don't know they're connecting, because their truth just shines through.
Well, in a way, to have something that's more advanced than what you quite understand pushes you forward. I mean, that's how I felt about getting towards those when we were little. I was starting stuff that was well beyond what they could do yet, because it gave them a place of experimentation.
Toyota.
Huh?
Toyota.
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 Now I know. Really?
All day long, it's this shit. All fucking day.
What?
Last suffering?
No.
I'm the one who's going to do the suffering. Better believe it.
That's right.
It's always good to have a little suffering. It wraps up your yoga.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. The challenge of a relationship can be the finishing school of yoga.
Or not.
the thing about it is that long-term is it actually makes sense in the context of stuff. But instead of it seems to me like it's singing the same phrases over and over again. It just seems like sure. So I can't differentiate one section from another. They have different titles and headings, but then they're all
well, it's splitting hairs of slightly different aspects of the same thing.
Yeah.
So it all tends to converge radically.
Right.
While sort of having a very, very, very slightly different nuance or implication of the aspect that's being involved in that particular statement, versus other statements which are essentially the same statement with a very slightly different spin.
Right. Yeah, the subtlety of this spin.
Yeah. But the point is he throws out all these different things, and whichever ones click or connect, then that makes it valuable.
Yeah.
And then in other contexts, other ones may be the ones that connect or click. And so it's not a matter of accumulate. It's not like you have to, it's not a series where you have to accumulate and go through each one until you get them all. It's not like that. But anyone that clicks takes you to what it is about, even if something else that doesn't click, that's taking you to the same place, is not clicking.
It's just like he talks. I mean,
Yeah,
you say
totally.
the same thing over and over in many
Yeah,
different ways.
I'm only talking about one thing, and I talk about it in infinitely different ways. An off chance that something I say will click for someone.
Right. Yeah, I told my neighbor once, and then she said, well, that was very good, but
I have no idea. Good for them.
She's like, yes, it's totally true. Guess I'm just a little slower.
About a friend who fell asleep. Falling asleep.
Well, there is one theory.
She said, everyone needs to hear this thing every now and again.
There is one theory that we spiritual people and yogis are actually the slow ones, because we have to deal with this stuff, and everyone else just listens to me. What's the fuck? Who gives a shit?
Yeah.
Walks away and leaves. It's like they don't need it.
I told
They're beyond it.
I told my brother, he said, what were you retreating from? I wrote that one. I said, oh, it was just a technical term we use.
It's a sales tactic.
Yeah.
It says that in the book.
Really a bunch of us all, we just went and hung out.
It's a party. It's a party in the desert.
Like, oh, okay, well, that sounds
Nice
good.
to have an excuse.
Hanging out with a bunch of buddies in the desert. I was thinking about that a little bit last night. We went to see a symphony performance, and I was thinking, every person on that stage is an obsessive maniac, or they wouldn't have spent their lives learning these instruments and end up to sit up there and bust their ass and practice and work for hours and hours and years to do this one silly performance that most of the people aren't going to get anyway. And I thought, well, it's just like spirituality. You get to do it. I've been working with this all my life.
But some people like Nancy just do it right.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, that's just the thing, though, playing in my music, playing
Yeah, sure.
orchestras.
Oh, I think it's lovely, but I think it's lovely, but I'm a maniac. I think this is great, and I'm a maniac. But not everyone is, or I should say, maybe not everyone's a maniac in the same way. Maybe some people are maniacs for football, and that's their version of.
But when you're practicing, and then you're not practicing all your life, you're practicing in the now.
Totally.
I mean.
Oh yeah, playing music's a yoga. It's dancing with energy.
Yeah. So you don't. I mean, there's a lot of things like that.
Oh, totally. Well, everything is like that, of course,
Well,
ultimately.
everything.
When you find out you can feel like this without having to make reasons,
Yeah.
why should I go through that anymore?
Yeah, right.
I mean, in a way, it's sort of, it's very egotistical and it's very self-aggrandizing if when you're in the now, because what you're doing is you're thinking, I'm going to be great. This is going to be the most wow thing that's ever been, created,
Yeah,
written,
sure. Yeah.
or played, I mean, you are sort of crazy.
Oh, totally. No, I totally get it. I mean, I'm a maniac.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in the middle of learning an instrument. I'm obsessed with doing it as well as I possibly can.
Yeah.
I mean, completely obsessed. I'm a nutcase about it.
So I really can't.
But it's all
understand that.
subjective. It's just all internal. Like there's this big carrot hanging up there, imaginary, of like playing better, and I'm always like reaching for it.
Yeah, I mean, this whole, because sort of, I've never been able to I mean, I do sort of understand that it's sort of the idea, the suffering artist, you have to suffer to create great art, or, you have to live under the sign of Saturn, and all that. But that's just the opposite. I mean, it's the mirror opposite of, thinking you're going to be really great. I mean,
Well-
self-deprecation is the same as self-aggrandizing.
Sure.
in a sense.
Yeah.
So,
Because you're denying yourself as you are now.
you say what?
When we think that we're going to, and I've done things too, so I know.
Yeah.
You think you're going to be great, well, you're denying yourself as you are now. So self-deprecation in favor of a chimera that stands in.
Right.
Yeah, that's, yeah. But I was actually thinking more, I am. I mean, I think, when
Well, that's true. Then you come back and there's no self-deprecation.
yeah, but
That's where you
it's hard to get rid of.
Well, there's a lot of pride in learning something and aspiring to do it well, because of the self-appraisal that you have the capability, you may potentially have the capability.
Yeah,
So, I mean, there's just an inherent, a feeling of maybe I can do this, maybe I can do it really well, and then there's the attempt to manifest that.
yeah,
So it's all basically oriented on, a positive self-orientation, as I call it.
yeah.
Mm-mm.
Who has the pleasure of doing it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the aspiring, I mean, speaking for myself, the aspiration to do it as well as possible is subtly an addition to just enjoying doing it in the moment. I'm speaking for myself as a musician. I always aspire to do it really, really well, and I always aspire to do it better than I am doing it, and I definitely enjoy doing it whenever I'm doing it. So when I play music, I enjoy the hell out of it, and I also intend to do it better next time. So it's quite a little bit, but that's just me, definitely it's probably, yeah, I'm sure it's very typical. I mean, I'm sure it's wonderful to be someone who can just, do it and just, boy, that was great. I really liked that.
Or isn't it more like you begin to feel the fun and the power and skill of your experience?
Yeah, there's a joy in developing skillfulness
Yeah, and then
and developing
what
polish.
you do with it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I think so. But it's different approaches. But again, this is all getting into the nuance of different ways of engaging with energy, which is down to the temperament, because everyone has different sort of dominant modes of the ways that let's call it strengths and weaknesses, of the ways that they engage with energy.
Also, there's a sense that to this period of time, and more enjoying it, it seems to like, you can look back and see how you thought it was at the time,
Mm-hmm.
but actually, it's just very similar. In fact, I often find that when there is that sense of gratitude or recognition and thinking that something is good, I would see that as a flag
Uh-oh, I'm
Yeah.
not seeing
Yeah, yeah.
something here, because I'm telling myself this is really good. It's like a blinder that just comes right in.
See, you strive for excellence too.
She makes sure she never gets.
Fortunately, that's not too hard to do. There's always room for improvement.
There's sort of a joy in discovering capabilities that.
Oh, absolutely. You know, there's a joy in again, it's a mode of the sacrament of energy, of direct energy engagement. You know, there's a joy in manifesting, a joy in dancing with the energy and working it and finding avenues of potential. You know.
Right.
I was listening to those singers last night, like, especially that lady, you know, how amazing her voice was. The things she was doing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if she was enjoying it or not. It didn't sound like she was, but I sure enjoyed it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, the sheer
Well,
quality.
that's a project for total obsessiveness.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, exactly. It works. I mean, to get to that level of singing, you know, you have to be talented to begin with, but you have to bust your ass all the time forever.
I don't know what it's like in music, but like in writing, it's well, there's a sense that it's already been done or written, and all I'm trying to do is just get to that point. But I never get to that, to that point. I mean, it's sort of in the back of my mind, I sort of know what it's supposed to be and sound like.
Mhm.
And one of the big curses was, with word processing, was cut and paste and erase and everything. You know, you can just go on forever.
Oh yeah, sure.
You know what I mean?
I could tweak this one a little more.
Yeah.
Let me turn this one on.
But that comes from it's already there. I mean, what am I comparing it to? You know, it's sort of like, and I'm sure it could be like that in music. You know what the sound is going to be, and you're just pursuing it.
Well, it's just about quitting time, so I'm going to say goodnight to our online friends.